Welcome to Global Signs. I'm Bruce Han. David Burrows is a truly interesting person. He's the founder and CEO of Capstone, a global policy-focused consultancy that helps companies predict policy, gauge the impact, and align their investments in an increasingly complex regulatory environment. David started his career in finance, working at Merrill Lynch and JP Morgan. We have the great pleasure of speaking with him today from Washington, D.C. David, thank you for joining us on Global Signs.
Thank you for having me, Bruce.
Thank you. Now, you used to work for President Biden. How would you grade his administration?
It's a good question, Bruce. I did work for President Biden early in my career, and what I know about the president is that he is an intelligent man, a stable leader, but I think what most people are excited about in this town is that this administration is boring. And after 4 years of the excitement of the Donald Trump White House, I think most Americans want a boring White House.
Now, what has surprised you most about politics, economy, and business in the past year?
I think what surprised me the most is how divisive COVID has been. COVID has been a huge divider in this country, and unlike in the past, Americans have simply not come together and have really pulled to their separate tribes. Democrats and Republicans have vastly different views about policy related to COVID, and it's a persistent problem in this country. And it's a problem economically because most people are still working from homes, and it is a big problem for this White House.
Now, what are the foreign policy priorities of the Biden administration?
The biggest one is to repair what they see as the damage that was done during the Trump years to our alliances, our alliances in Europe, NATO in particular, and our alliances in Asia, including our alliance with Korea. So that has very clearly and very publicly been the #1 priority for this administration. But there are other priorities that are much less public that the White House doesn't want to talk about. One of those is leveraging things that were done by the Trump White House, in particular, leveraging the work that the Trump White House did vis-a-vis China and really toughening up the relationship on trade when it comes to China. The Biden administration does not want to backtrack. It wants to go forward and really leverage that work that was done.
David, you're an expert in analyzing the intersection between policy and investments. How do you think Biden's foreign policy goals affect investment opportunities in Asia and the U.S.?
I think one big area that we're going to see, and investors and international companies have to come to grips with it, is the massive change that we've seen in supply chains. So U.S. policy on a number of fronts added to the COVID pandemic really means that the era of just-in-time manufacturing, I think, is over. And so I think policies are combining to make, I think, every CEO globally really reconsider how they're structuring supply chains. We're going to see more companies building smaller manufacturing plants closer to their market. In the United States, I think that has us very excited that foreign companies, Korean companies included, will build more and more manufacturing in the United States to take advantage of the market.
Now, what are investors most worried about in the policy world right now?
It's a great question, Bruce. I think investors are worried about everything right at this moment. Globally, they're worried about the U.S.-China relationship. They're worried about Russia and Ukraine. Economically, they're worried about inflation. Inflation has people very worried. Investors are worried that there is an asset bubble in a lot of different categories. And politically, they're worried about growing divisiveness in almost every country in which they operate. So it is a difficult picture right now for investors. There are a lot of worries.
David, you're advising Korean companies regarding ESG. What are some of the challenges that Korean companies now face in order to adjust to ESG guidelines and requirements?
It's a great question, Bruce. I think the biggest concern that companies have is that there's no one set of standards for ESG. Companies are confused about how to apply ESG rules to different business models. An ESG plan for a pipeline company is very different than an insurance company. So the different playing field has got companies extremely worried. They don't want to be criticized for doing nothing, but they also don't want to do the wrong things.
Now, finally, what are the most promising sectors and stocks for 2022?
We have three ideas that we're talking about, and not surprisingly, all of them are about US policy. So Intel, SKinobeaition. For Intel, we believe a piece of legislation will pass called the American Competes Act, which will create $50 billion of incentives for semiconductor manufacturing and semiconductor fabs. That is going to be a huge tailwind for a lot of companies, but Intel, I think, in particular. Second, we think there's a piece of legislation that's coming quite soon that will create $15 billion of incentives for electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries. SKinobeaition just finished a plant in Georgia, and that will come online in 2023. And I think that will be a big boost to their earnings. And the incentives that the US Congress will pass will only help.
David Burrows, CEO and founder of Capstone based in Washington, D.C., thank you so much for taking time to talk with our viewers today about interesting insights on the market and policy world.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. David recommends two stocks for our investors. The first stock is Intel, and the second stock is SKinobeaition. Thank you so much for being with us today. Until we meet next week, please be safe, healthy, and vigilant.